All right. Cool. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Today, our group is going to be sharing with you guys how to make effective presentations efficiently. We're going to take you through the whole process from when you first learn that you need to make a presentation to making your slides all the way to actual presentation day. And to start, we want to hear from you guys first. And so Joshua is going to lead us on a 5-minute group activity.
Yeah, so we have two questions. Just go to the link above where it says pollev.com/Hyungcho Kim 282. If you guys need help, we'll probably put it in the chat as well. Just in a word or in a short phrase, if it's a short phrase, use hyphens. What is your biggest pet peeve when it comes to presentations? Yeah. Okay, there we go. Okay, we have overtime. You have bad color use. Yeah, it's fine, Professor Gervin. Yeah. We have long. We have bad jokes, boring. Yeah, so this is good. We'll probably give it another minute or so. Yeah, these are a lot of very good things, and we'll go over a lot of these in our presentation as well, which is very good.
Yep. Cool. Maybe then we can move on to the next question that we have.
Sure, yeah. And then the next question we have is, again, same thing, just answering the poll. We already have some sample answers. In a word or short phrase, what is your biggest fear when it comes to presenting? And you should be able to answer in the same poll. Okay. We have audience judgment. That's actually one of my big fears too. Stuttering, yep. You can also, if you agree with something, you can enter it again to make it bigger, or to make the word bigger, and to re-emphasize the. So, for example, if someone else thinks like answering questions poorly, you can answer that. You can enter that into the poll again.
Yep. And I see that a lot of these things in terms of maybe not being as clear or forgetting and blanking on what you're supposed to say. These are all very like valid concerns, and we all experience it, especially I do too. And so we're going to be later talking about how you can maybe, perfect your script and your practice routine to be able to best avoid having these fears actually come true when you are presenting. Cool.
Yeah.
All right, so this was really informative. Hopefully we can answer a lot of these fears and address them and help you guys work through them. And so now Javier is going to go ahead and tell you guys a little bit about starting up your presentation.
All right, thank you, Gloria. So yeah, so for the first section, I'll be basically talking about a few aspects that you can take into consideration for the initial preparations of your presentation, and a few aspects that will help you to plan a timeline to work on your presentation before the presentation day. And hopefully it will also help you to overcome most of the fears that you stated in the previous activity. So even though there is not like an ultimate recipe for preparing a scientific presentations, in different strategies work best for different people, I'm introducing you to a compilation of good practices of what you need to consider from the moment you know you're giving a scientific presentation. And I like to start off by bringing this quoted sentence to your attention, which I think summarizes the importance of making effective scientific presentations and introduces us to the first piece of advice. So from the moment we know we're giving a presentation, pretty much all the resources we found emphasize that we need to first think about who actually will be listening to our presentation. Perhaps most of us do not really think about this because we mostly give presentations to our lab meetings or departmental research in progress. So we typically assume that most of the people will have a capacity to understand our work, given that they might be familiarized with the topic already. But experts say that, however, experts say that taking the time to think deeply on your audience will still enable you to not only define your message you like to convey more easily, but also to communicate the message more effectively. So even when you're presenting for lab meetings, it is still a good practice thinking the kind of audience you will have. So for example, you can think of how many of your lab mates will actually understand your research project. Also, you can think on the composition, for example, how many undergrads, postdocs, or grad students are, and how many of those actually have the knowledge to follow you with the complex concepts. So there could be another situation where you might want to present a novel method you just found, and you want to convince your advisor, your lab mate that that method is suitable for your research and for your want to accomplish. So as you can see, so things start to get a bit complex, but at the end, so those kind of questions and considerations will lead you to a better design of your presentation. So for other situations or like small conferences or international conferences, it will be practically impossible to consider each individual attending to the presentation, but you can still have a good understanding of the audience if you, for instance, ask directly to the organizers, take a look at the website of the event, dive into the social media like Twitter, which sometimes becomes pretty popular, especially for big conferences. Or you could ask people you know have attended or have given a talk at the same conference before. But at the end of the day, regardless of the type of audience that you may face, experts recommend, as a rule of thumb, that you structure your presentation to reach a non-expert. And this is because we often worry too much about offending the experts in the room with basic information, but even experts appreciate a little refresher here and there. So now that we have a clear idea of what the audience might be, that will help us to define now our presentation type. So we as a grad students or scientists in general are often asked to give original research presentations, which could be either in long format or short format. But these presentations typically are informative, where for the most part we present our more recent findings of our research, and we usually structure these presentations like a scientific paper, right? Where we give an introduction, we point out the methods that we use, present the results, and then give our interpretation and conclusions with our results. So for those kinds of presentations, it is always a good idea to minimize the use of jargon. But if the use is inevitable, we could always try to use some real world analogies so we can maximize the understanding of those complex concepts that we might have presented. But we might also have the opportunity to give other kinds of scientific presentations, like especially for broader audiences, where probably would be more appropriate to design or talk more as a regular lecture. And these lecture type presentations are usually instructional, where the goal is maybe to teach a new concept or to perform show how to perform a specific task. And here our advice would be also the use of analogies to explain complex concepts. But also we recommend the use of takeaway slides to remember your audience what the main message is. And lastly, I think proposal presentations are also, research proposal presentations are also quite common among scientists or science community, where here basically you try to convince your audience what you want to do, what you want to do is innovative and feasible. So these kinds of presentations tend to be more persuasive. But I mean, even though all the tips that we presented could apply to any kind of presentation, for research proposal, I think being concise and going direct to the point is key. So But regardless of the type of presentation, I think it's always important to consider that the more complex your topic is, the more important is the use of analogies, especially if you know your audience is going to be diverse. Then once you have designed your presentation time and everything, you need to consider now how long the presentation will be and how much time you will actually have to put the slides together. So keeping in mind that if, for instance, you have 1 month to the day of the presentation, so you need to consider how much of that month you will spend to work in your presentation. So how much time you will have to make new slides from your most recent findings, and if possible, how many slides you might want to recycle from previous presentations. But the most important message here is that you always have to prepare your presentation in advance. This will save you a lot of pain during the presentation day. So now that preparing, we know that we need to prepare in advance. So preparing in advance also includes practicing your presentation as many times as possible before the presentation day. So now I'm here just presenting some useful tips that you might want to consider when you're practicing your presentation. So first, you can rehearse in front of a crowd where you can practice either with experts or not experts or a combination of both. This will help you to have a sense of how effectively you are transmitting your message and how clear it is. Also here you can implement a scale-up approach where you first practice with yourself, and then you can practice with some lab mates, then you can practice with more people from your department, and ultimately you can practice with your advisor or a group of postdocs, for instance. So then you can also take notes so you can remember the sections of your presentation that need to be improved. Also, you can write down the questions to ask yourself. And also you can try to experiment with different presentation styles or techniques and find the one that you feel more comfortable with. So it is also very important that you time yourself so you make sure that you're not going beyond the time limit. Although some experts say that it might be a good idea to always plan to finish before the allotted time, so you are sort of prepared of any unforeseen situation that might happen during the presentation day. So likely it is always a good idea to record yourself to make a self-assessment of the overall presentation performance. So now that we have talked about what we need to consider and what we could do for practicing our presentation, I'd like to go over some interesting resources that I think will be useful for you and that you can start applying right away for your next presentation. The Robert Smith School of Business from the university actually has a great and long list of public speaking resources that you can consult anytime. And we're putting all the links in the slides and also in the handout that we're making available to you. So from that list, I would like to go over two in particular that I think are very useful and that everyone should know or should be aware of. So the first one is an article written by Nancy Duarte, where basically she explains on how to structure your presentation like a story, because she realized that most effective presenters usually use the same techniques as great storytellers. So where they create a message that is easy to digest, remember, and retell by the audience, by just simply following the Aristotle three-part story structure where you have a beginning, a middle, and the end. So she says that basically you can start by crafting the beginning by describing life as it is, as the audience knows it. So this creates a bond between you and the audience and opens them up to hear your ideas for a change. So after you said that baseline of what is, then you can introduce your vision of what could be. So that gap between the two will throw the audience a little bit of balance, but she said that that's a good thing to keep the audience engaged. And then once you establish that gap, you can use the rest of the presentation to fill it up. And that's what you're gonna do in the middle part, where you will keep playing up the contrast between the what is and what could be. So at the end, so she still recommends to end with a powerful ending where you do not end or you are avoiding a boring list of to-dos. So Nancy said that you basically need to include a call to action. but you need to make it inspire so people will want to act. So she basically says that you need to describe what she calls the new bliss, which is basically telling the audience or knowing, let the audience know that how much better their world will be when they adopt your new ideas that you just presented. So another useful resource that I think might help a lot of us is this 7-minute warm up that you could do about 50 to 30 minutes before your presentation. Just basically, this quick routine is intended to calm down your nerves and calm down and manage your nerve before you're giving the presentation. And I think this is very helpful because it is always right before the presentation where our nerves peak, right? So this exercise, this routine includes the breathing exercises, resonance tones up, and I included a link so you can watch a video on how to do those voice resonance exercises. You can do projection arm swings, facial warm-up, basically massaging your face, tongue twisters to improve articulation, and then you could do muscle isolations and stretches to be physically prepared for your presentation. So I think these are very useful resources that we could apply and that I'm sure will help us a lot when making or preparing for a big presentation. So now Ashley and Gloria will give you the details on how actually you can make the slides to make an effective presentation.
Thanks, Javier, for those tips and resources. Now that you've defined your type of talk and audience, how do you go about preparing your slides? In this section, we will delve into how to use slide design to your advantage to efficiently convey your content. Let's start off with a quick example of what not to do. So for this, I try to make the worst possible design slide, and I'll go over some of the issues with this slide really quickly. For one, this slide uses a really unforgiving color combination with a red background and green text, which is difficult to read and inaccessible. The use of serif font makes the content difficult to read, and so is the title in all caps. There are paragraphs of text on this slide, which would be really difficult for an audience to interpret. In addition, the image used has non-legible axes and legends, which makes it hard to interpret any of the data in the image. And the slide uses some very unnecessary fancy animations. So all of these things in combination obfuscate what the slide might be actually trying to tell you. So from here on, let's go over some basic principles of slide design based on what we saw in the previous slide. First off, it's usually good to have your main takeaway point from the slide as a slide title to help anchor your audience. With text, use a sans serif font, which is more readable than serif fonts. Try to use minimal text. Instead, try to use more graphics and visuals, which we'll be discussing in detail how to incorporate more graphics and visuals later in this presentation. Try to avoid blocks of text or paragraphs. In general, more than 2 lines of text become difficult to read for the audience. Have a font size greater than 18 point, but you could use a smaller font size for references in a corner of the slide, and don't use all caps either in the slide titles or anywhere in the content. When it comes to color and visuals, use contrast to your advantage. For instance, have white text against a dark background, avoid red-green color combinations at all costs, and ensure legible axes, titles, and legends. In general, try not to have any fancy animations. A simple appear or fade in tends to be extremely effective most of the time, and have 1 to 2 takeaway points per slide to make the content more digestible for your audience. Now going into some specifics on how to use color. Keep your slide theme simple with high contrast. For instance, a dark background with light text or light background with dark text work really well. Use color strategically, as too much of color can also be really distracting for your audience. Text color can be used to match plot colors to help guide the listener. So for instance, the plot on the right, what I'm trying to say in that plot would be that the magnitude of condition B is higher than the magnitude of condition A. And so I could match the colors in my text to match the color in the plot itself to help make that point more clear for my audience. When you're trying to keep colors consistent across different graphics, you could use eyedropper tools, such as those offered in PowerPoint, or Chrome extensions for eyedropper tools like the one shown here, Colorzilla, may also be helpful. Another thing that's helpful is using hexadecimal or RGB color codes to maintain consistency between slides. Some other things to keep in mind with the use of color is to avoid red-green color combinations. So for instance, the image on the right is showing a heat map with the colors red and green in the first panel showing presumably an increase or decrease in a certain metric. But to someone with red-green color blindness, all of that nuance is lost and everything appears in the same hue. So to make your figures and plots more accessible, you could use colorblind-friendly palettes, such as those offered in R. You could also use simulators to check if your image is colorblind friendly. We'll be sharing some of these resources with you later as well. And if you have a lot of heat maps or microscopy images, try to use grayscale wherever possible. Otherwise, use colorblind friendly lookup tables. So for instance, in the image on the right, green, magenta, or cyan red are a good replacement for the green-red color combination. And if you need to use 3 colors, cyan, magenta, yellow together work pretty well. Color, however, is not your only tool. There's an entire family of visual attributes that you can use to your advantage when presenting graphics or slides. The main idea behind the use of these visual attributes is that these help your brain to quickly identify patterns in your data. Depending on the nature of your data, some visual attributes might be more appropriate. For instance, using spatial tools such as 2D position or spatial grouping of the data. It is, however, important to remember that some attributes can be more effective than others. So for instance, one of the most powerful visual attributes you can use is to use color or hue to highlight a data point that you want to draw the audience's attention to, while size-based attributes such as area or volume may not be as effective. It's also important to use attributes consistently to emphasize key points in text and graphics throughout your presentation. From now, I'll hand over to Gloria, who'll talk about how to maintain flow in your presentations.
All right, so thank you, Ashley. So now I want to talk a bit about how we can craft slides to create and maintain flow and keep the audience focused on the core themes of your presentation. So starting with the title slide and the overview slide, the main goal is to set clear expectations for what's coming up. And so to do this, we want to be very simple and concise. So for the title slide, I have found most success as a presenter and also on the audience side with shorter jargon-free titles with minimal graphics. So if you see on the bottom left there, you can see there's like a small diagram that's quite hard to see in a quick amount of time. We'd ideally like to avoid that. And the same goes for the overview slide, which one may not always be necessary if you have a short presentation, but for longer presentations, it may be helpful to outline the structure of what you're going to be presenting and to inform your audience about things like when you'll be open to taking questions or feedback. And so an important application is if you want to have like a discussion in the middle of your presentation, you want to have your audience members kind of queued up to prepare for that discussion. All right, so for longer presentations on complex topics, it can be quite challenging to keep the audience attentive and focused. And so to maintain flow, I recommend not just using an overview slide at the beginning to help anchor your audience, but also to present these intermediate conclusions at regular intervals throughout your presentation, such as after a particularly dense method section. And so in another example, if I had like 2 research questions that I wanted to answer in my research proposal, and I had all these complicated methods that I presented for each one, your intermediate conclusion slide can basically show each research question in a brief list of the methods that you plan to use to address the research question. And that would be a really helpful tool to kind of summarize your approach. All right, so aside from providing intermediate conclusions, you can also help keep and maintain flow with visual elements as well. So in this example here, I have several talking points about the prevalence of child poverty and its relevance to informing policy. And so instead of representing all of this information at once in black and white, I connect the graphic and the corresponding text talking about how 1 in 7 children experience poverty in the US with the color red. And during the presentation, I actually have these 2 elements appear together, and then the other text and image appear later in sequence. And so this is an example of how color and motion can be used in combination to help maintain focus and flow in your presentation. All right, another really effective way to capture attention is to try to tell a cohesive story, as we mentioned before, whether it is with your script or if it's with your visual elements. And so you guys know that stories have characters, and whether the character in your own field is, a person, a disease, a protein, or even a type of technique, you can depict your character via a visual component throughout your presentation. So in this case here, these are some slides I used for my qualifying exam. And so I basically tell the story of how negative life experiences associated with socioeconomic hardship can affect a child's behavior. And then in the next slide, I use the same image or character to show how these behavioral impacts can lead to increased vulnerability to the development of anxiety and depression in later life. And so here I use this image to serve as a key character to discuss how development and adversity can be linked. All right, so next up, I want to talk about including graphics in combination or in place of words. And so breaking up blocks of text using graphics or even labeled graphics can be quite effective. And so in this example, I opted to define socioeconomic as a term visually instead of via text. So where I show the first term socio as having to do with things like occupation or education, and economic as being stuff related to monetary value, such as actual money you may have or things you may own, like property. And in the second example, I actually include graphics as a part of my dialogue. So in this case, I incorporate these pictures in my actual sentence that I say. And so while I present, I'll say something like peripheral nerve injury can occur through cuts, bruises, bullet wounds, etc., and cause all of these other adverse outcomes down the line. And so in the presentation, I would also use motion. And so as I read out each type, they would appear in sequence. And so you can see that this can be, pretty visually appealing instead of having a big block of words or text that list out all of the different causes of peripheral nerve injury in this case. Okay, and in speaking of graphics and visuals, I am particularly very fond of using dynamic visuals in presentations in the form of GIFs. And so I wanted to introduce you to this very easy tool called Screen to GIF that I've been using over the years, which basically allows you to capture your screen. So like if you have a YouTube video open, and you can basically cut a clip out and be able to create your own GIF and edit the length and speed of it. And so I found this to be a very simple and effective tool for making my presentations very exciting, I guess, to see. And so now I want to show you some applications of GIFs that I've used in my past presentations. And so the first application is to dynamically visualize experiments and methods. So in a presentation I did for a class assignment, I had to present a study that used electrical stimulation to promote nerve regeneration and leg function of rodents. And they basically tested leg function in rodents by looking at things like how they responded when their feet were shocked, and also how they navigated a horizontal ladder that was suspended in the air. And so instead of writing out this protocol via text, what I did was I went on YouTube and I Googled up these protocols, and I captured small video clips of the experiment happening in real time. And I used these GIFs to visually demonstrate as I had a dialogue going in the background, describing what the actual experiment was. And I found that to be quite effective. And what I just showed you was an example of how you can dynamically visualize methods, but you can even do this for your background section. And so in this presentation that I was doing, I was trying to give context into the utility of using skin conductance measurements to study anxious states in humans. And so instead of writing out how people tend to sweat through the densely packed pores of their fingertips when anxious, I found a cool YouTube clip that showed this exact response. And I added a picture of a hand and put the GIF in a callout box to be able to show the concept of exactly what is happening during a skin conductance response. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ashley, who's going to be talking about other ways to include graphics in presentations.
Thanks, Gloria. One type of visual that you may end up using while making research presentations or for a journal club are figures from a research paper. Some key points to keep in mind when using figures from a paper. First off, don't copy figures straight from the research paper or take a screenshot of a PDF of the paper. Try to reduce the figure into its minimum essential components. What are the fewest number of panels that you need on your slide to support the conclusions provided with the help of the figure? You could also split up a large figure like the one on the right into multiple slides to make each conclusion easier to digest. Don't show figure panels that you won't be addressing, and use animations to reveal figure panels one at a time. You can use white boxes to hide any extra elements that cannot be readily cropped out of the figures, but elements that you will not be talking about. Ensure legible access titles, legends, and labels. This could mean using white boxes on top of the original image and then typing in the access titles with a larger font instead of making the graphic larger, which could make your image look grainy. And related to that is the use of high resolution figures. So if you have access to the journal website, download the high resolution figure provided on some of those websites instead of taking a screenshot from the paper. As an example, here I represent the first half of the figure from the earlier slide. The main takeaway point from the figure is used as the slide title to help guide the audience. As all of the panels on this slide contribute to the same conclusion, but to make it easier to digest, I introduce these one by one with the help of disappearing white boxes. As each subpanel appears, I would talk about the results from the specific experiments performed in these plots and how these relate to the main conclusion from the slide. These panels could also be divided into multiple slides depending on what you're trying to convey to your audience. Another type of graphic you might end up using to present your research is one for your experimental methods. So here I have a slide that I used to use in my presentations, going over the experimental workflow from isolation of cells to activation under certain conditions and a description of how the imaging was performed with a couple of accompanying graphics. While this slide does contain graphics, it's still a pretty text-heavy slide, and so I try to convert it to a more visual format. To this end, I used Biorender, which is a free online tool especially suited for illustrations to represent biological concepts and workflows. Each bullet point from the previous slide has been given its own panel with related graphics. So for instance, instead of saying cells were purified from mice, I have a panel with a cartoon of a mouse and an arrow indicating that the cells were derived from the mouse. The slide is still fairly busy, so these panels can be made to appear one by one with the help of animations as I talk about each step of the experiment. The idea is that a graphics-based methods figure like this would help the audience have a better visual understanding of the experimental methodology used in my study. Biorender specifically is a fantastic and easy to use resource, especially for biology-related illustrations. And Gloria will be talking about this tool a little more in the next few slides.
All right. So talking a little bit more about Biorender, I don't know if you guys used Canva before to make graphics or anything like that, but it's basically like Canva, but make it a little bit more science-like. And so it's a really great resource, as Ashley said, to make your slides or even your papers a lot more engaging and informative. There is a slight paywall. And so if you want to publish with the figures or access certain features, you do need to pay. So you can see that they provide you with a variety of different templates, all the way from like cell differentiation to even a computational biology workflow. And so it's quite a dynamic range of templates. So I really encourage you guys to try to check it out. And other than templates, you can also craft your own figures. And so you can see on the bottom just the different ranges of small like elements that you can include in your figure or slide. All the way from maybe showing different methods to different types of proteins. Okay, and so this is an example that Ashley has shown of a video of her actually crafting and making her figure that she showed a few slides back. So you can see just how easy it is when you just search up the different types of cells or animal models on the left-hand panel, and you can just click and drag and adjust figure elements and color and characteristics like that. And so I won't be playing the whole thing, but you guys will also have a link to this presentation if you're curious, so you'll be able to watch the whole thing. And so you can see here that you can do things like arrows and text boxes and adjust format and everything like that. Cool. So So although Biorender is mostly for scientific figures, so much of the concepts behind their templates and elements can be used for slide making. You know, they have had a whole team of graphic designers and scientists work together to curate these formats. And so instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, it would be really good to be efficient and take a look at the templates and the formats that they had to see if you can apply these same layouts to your slides. And so now I wanted to go through a few a few formats that I saw in Biorender that really stood out to me. And then I'll show you a little bit about how slide layout can help you convey your message. So in this first one, this is in the case of if we wanted to make comparisons. You can see that there's left and right panels and some kind of division in the middle. And you can see that not only are there different sides, there's also different color coding, but then there's a parallel theme going in between both of them where they show a neuron. And so here in this callout box, you'll be able to either put in text or other graphics to be able to visually draw parallels between two ideas. And then throughout these templates that I'm going to be showing you, you can see on the bottom left the source of these figure templates in case you want to go look at them yourself. So the second one is, let's say that you have this big concept that you're trying to refer to, but your research only focuses on a small subsection of it. That happens a lot in terms of brain networks, cellular biochemical pathways, things like that. And so what I really like is in this format, you can see the broader concept on the left, a small box or an outline that shows exactly what part of this larger pathway that you're focusing on, in a call out box that is connected with this transparent trapezoid to connect this. And then here you could also put text or more visuals to be able to show in a little bit more detail how your own research fits into this larger pathway. All right, now we're talking about flowcharts. You can see here that there are panels or images organized with arrows, labels, and even color coding. And this is really ideal for showing maybe the development of past research. If this is maybe applied to your background section, it can be used to describe the sequence of your methods or experiments. Or even in one case, maybe you can have like a broader system here, and then you can say each box stands for your specific aim. And so flowcharts are very dynamic, and Biorender has some really attractive looking templates to showcase this. And the last thing is broader scope. So at the end of our presentations, we always want to talk about how our research is important and why and what it can impact in the real world. And so what I really liked about this particular template is that your work or topic is displayed visually at the center. And you can see there's kind of like a web or a branching out where it shows all the different potential applications of your research. And so in my case, it might be looking at socioeconomic resources and how that can impact internalizing disorders like anxiety and depression. And then one of these bubbles can be something like informing science policy or informing better funding for schools. So that is it for the different templates on Biorender. And now I'm going to hand it over to Joshua.
Thank you, Gloria and Ashley. That was really, really informative. So now that we've organized our presentation and created our slides, let's go over a couple of tips on how to prepare for the day of the presentation. So first of all, one of the things that can be helpful is to create a script for your presentation. But what is a script? Well, a script is a written outline for what you want to say during the presentation. And it's especially helpful for if like me, you often get nervous during your presentation or otherwise have troubles coming up with what you want to say when presenting. It isn't necessary to use during your presentation, but it can be especially helpful to practice with even if you don't use it. When creating your script, try to experiment with different approaches to preparing your script. So for example, do you want your script to be word for word, or do you want some flexibility to improvise? Do you want the script to be used for the presentation or just have it for practice? If you use a script just for practice, it can help to at least have the opening memorized so that you can start off confidently. And we also recommend outlining your script first so that you know what you want to say. And so we'll go over some more tips for creating a script on the next couple of slides. So one of the important things when creating a script is to keep the wording conversational and semi-casual. So for example, don't make it too formal, like writing a paper, but also try not to make it too informal. So a good question to help guide you when creating a script would be, um, what would you normally say when giving a presentation? And feel free to add some phrases like, so what I'm showing you, or as you can see. So for example, you can see the script from the last slide in the image on the right. And so as you can see, scripts can be highlighted and bolded to help you guide you through your presentation and create emphasis. So as shown, scripts can be used to describe figures as well. And as a tip, you may even find it helpful to write your script before making your slides. Just food for thought. After you've created your script, remember to practice it and also practice your presentation. It can be helpful to practice in front of your peers to get their advice and to record yourself practicing to see how the script sounds to you. After each practice presentation, edit your script based on what does and doesn't work. As mentioned before, it helps to experiment with different approaches in front of different audiences to see what style works best. And so when it finally comes to presenting, bring a copy of your script, either printed out or on your laptop, so that you can use your script during your presentation. And it can even help to have a dual monitor for your script for online presentations. So now that we've created our script, and now that we've created our slides and have practiced for the presentation, the day finally arrives. You may feel nervous or completely prepared, but there's still a couple of things to keep in mind. So first, it may be wise to review your presentation and practice one more time. This can help with any last-minute preparations as well as any jitters that you may have. Secondly, remember to dress comfortably and confidently for your presentation. And if you have a chance, take a look at the venue beforehand to help decide what you want to wear. And lastly, remember to get a good night's sleep, have breakfast, and bring water with you to the presentation to hydrate. When you head to the presentation, remember to leave as early as you need to get to the venue to prepare and set up on time. For longer presentations, we recommend arriving about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour early. And for shorter presentations, we recommend arriving about 10 to 20 minutes early. Prepare ahead of time to make sure your commute is as smooth as possible, and remember to be aware of any weather or traffic conditions on the day of your presentation. So for example, you may be using public transportation, and so make sure you assess how long it will take for you to get to the venue and prepare accordingly. If you're new to the venue, make sure you know how to get to the presentation room and use a map or ask someone if you need to. For online presentations, make sure your internet connection is reliable and that you can get to the online room ahead of time to set up. Once you arrive, see if you can set up early, and remember to make sure your audio and visual have been prepared ahead of time to set up as quickly and smoothly as possible. So be sure to also bring multiple copies of your presentation and to ask for help ahead of time if you need it. So right before your presentation starts, remember to take a deep breath to calm your nerves if you need to, like so. And we actually recommend looking at the 7-minute public speaking warm-up guide that Javier actually mentioned earlier. Then, during the presentation, remember to keep an eye on the time. If there's no clock in sight, it can be helpful to wear a watch or set a silent timer on your phone to check back to once in a while. If possible, it can also help to have a friend or pointer person to let you know how much time you have left. It's also important to leave enough time for questions at the end, if needed. Leave about 5 to 10 minutes for questions for shorter talks, about 10 to 15 questions for minutes for longer talks. And remember also to keep to the script and to keep to what you have practiced, and don't try anything new or off book. And throughout the presentation, remember to assess whether the audience is engaged or losing interest. And so now we'll actually go over some tips for audience engagement. So one important tip is to connect and communicate with your audience throughout the presentation. This can be done in a multiple of ways, such as using eye contact or using a pointer or cursor, and to point out important things. And humor can also be effective if appropriate. You can also ask the audience about an engaging poll. So for example, raise your hand if you know someone who's had COVID, or ask them a question. So for example, have you ever wondered how COVID is transmitted? Be sure to give your audience a few seconds to think about it. And another tip is to make sure your audience is understanding and following along with your presentation. And so don't be afraid to ask for questions from the audience if you think that they're losing interest. Another tip is summed up in this quote. Think about the least knowledgeable person in the audience. So for example, what do they know? What don't they know? And remember to present and create your presentation accordingly. Remember that you are the most knowledgeable about your presentation, and it's your goal to get your points across effectively. I'd like to end the presentation with a couple of tips by Susan McConnell from Stanford University, that I think will be very helpful going forward. And we'll share all of these tips at the end through we'll hand out the PowerPoint at the end. First, vary your volume, tone, and pitch, and overall vocal presence, as well as using occasional pauses, as these can be very helpful for engaging your audience. Second, use body language and gestures, and don't be afraid to make use of this physical space around you if you're presenting in person. And third, don't just tell us about your topic, but paint a picture and describe what you want to tell us. And finally, study the great presenters. What do great speakers like Steve Jobs do to engage their audience? And as always, get feedback from your peers and practice, practice, practice. And with that note, we'd like to share some of the resources, and I'll hand it off to Gloria to discuss the resources.
All right, so thank you guys so much for listening. So in these last two slides, when you guys get sent the link to them, you'll be able to see that we have compiled some resources that we thought would be super helpful, but we unfortunately did not have time to go through all of these today. And so I really hope that you guys check it out. And with that, thank you guys so much for your time, and let us know if you have any questions or comments.